welcome back to PA Chalk Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have Bri. Hi Bri, how we doing?
Good, Manny. Excited to be on.
So, if you just give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, for sure. I'm the head women's basketball strength and conditioning coach at the University of Miami, and I work exclusively with women's basketball. And then before I took the job down here at Miami, I was the director of women's basketball sports performance at the University of Pittsburgh. And prior to that, I was the high performance director for one of the NWSL clubs, Racing Louisville, for a season. And then prior to that, I was at the University of Houston. I worked women's basketball and women's soccer, and I was there for about 3 seasons or 3 years. And then right before that, I was at Utah State University where I did my graduate assistantship. And gosh, I worked everything. So I was assisting with football. I primarily had women's soccer, gymnastics, and then was heavily assisting men's and women's basketball, volleyball, softball, and then track and field as well. So kind of a whole department on my GA, but then after that, I've mostly stuck with women's basketball and then kind of sprinkled in women's soccer a little bit too. So that's kind of where I've gotten from where I started in college and then to where I am today.
As a strength coach, we deal a lot with Excel's, spreadsheets, and building out the best program that we can for our athletes. Although, when you have these large amount of spreadsheets and Excels and printables and packs that you need to hand out to your athletes, it can get a little bit overwhelming, especially with large amount of files. Mine's personally has crashed, deleted, and that to me is a big burden. That's why since starting my own business, I've went with Team Builder. Team Builder is an all-in-one programming software that has truly changed and leveled up the way I coach and the way I program for my athletes. With Team Builder, you can create customizable workouts, track your athletes' progress in real time, and even generate performance reports with just a few clicks. Athletes can also fill out their own workout data by using either the tablet or their smartphones in the weight room, which, most importantly, eliminates the paperwork that we all hate. This also gives your athletes accountability for their program and their progress as they are immersed within it. If you are interested in using TeamBuilder, head over to teambuilder.com and sign up using code PAChalkup. That's PACHALKUP to start your 30-day free trial. Yeah, I think there's a running theme with the basketball.
So my first exposure to basketball was actually like my GA when I was at the college level. So I was assisting with the men's and women's basketball teams out at Utah State. Um, and that was kind of like my first exposure to training basketball athletes. Obviously had
Wow.
like a really great time doing it, which is, why I was able to, continue it down at Houston and obviously, still kind of kept with my soccer background, was able to help with the soccer team as well.
Yeah. Like the thing that I love about the US collegiate system is like as an S&C coach, you can get exposed to so many different sports, like either from interning or GA positions, and like that can develop into like specific or just keep in the Olympic realm where you're exposed to so many different sports. What did you find that was beneficial to what you do now, having all these different sort of sports?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, and I tell this to, any of my assistants or anyone that, wants advice or talks to me about like how I kind of came up and who I learned under is that, when I was starting as my GA, like that was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to me was that I worked with so many different sports. And not only that, but I worked with so many athletes and coaching staffs. Like that just exposed me to different styles of coaching staffs, how they went about things, how they structured their teams, how they wanted their strength coach involved. But then on top of it too, like I was exposed to so many different personalities, learning
Mhm.
preferences, and then also too, like when you're working from sport to sport, there's obviously like a different type of culture with every sport. How they work in the weight room, how they work on the court or the field. So that in itself was amazing. But then I think working with so many teams too, that's what really helped develop like my coaching voice. I just felt so comfortable coaching, an O lineman in their, lift, and a women's tennis player in their lift. So, um, I got to work with both male and female sports, and I thought that was really great. But I think it's like interesting too, like when you start saying like, oh, like I've worked with, football, I've worked with soccer, I've worked with basketball, is that, I think the term or the coin term of like sports specific is like,
Mm.
really swung super far. Or that's kind of the buzzword. Um, what I really saw when I was a GA was just the athletes that we work with and the age group that we work with them in. It's like a really, really high developmental. But I just found that like the age group that we worked with, that 18 to 22, maybe 23, I guess now, if you have a couple of grad transfers, is that a lot of them still really need development. And as much as we want to make the weight room, the sports specific spot, I think in general, we are very much strength generalists to basically create better athletic adaptation so they can then be better athletes when they're playing their sport. Um, so, from again, working with a football team, like you're talking about like specimens, like we had,
Mhm.
NFL first round draft
Mutants.
picks, in that group that I was lucky enough to be able to assist and be around. It's not like you're dealing with, just some random Joe from the street. Um, but how they trained and what they need, you know, I wouldn't say looked too far off in terms of principles. Um, from what I, wanted to give to my women's soccer team, to my women's basketball team, to the men's tennis team, the men's golf team. Development and strength generalists is generally what a lot of these athletes need, because they're so good at playing their sport already. So I think that was
100%.
something that, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, like, football, some of their stuff looks very similar to, what I'm seeing some of the mentors that I'm doing, what the principles that they're outlining with their different teams, they all kind of follow similar suits. How you go about it might be a little bit different in terms of methodology, but the overlying principle of how we were training was very similar. And I think that was all kind of based around, again, like training principles, standards, and like what you're looking to do. So I
Mhm.
was lucky enough to learn from some really great people, again, working with a vast majority of sports and then being able to see that how that's executed across. And obviously it's stuff
Um,
that, I've picked up and, I still continue to use even with my women's basketball teams.
yeah, and this is something that's frequently discussed on this podcast. Is a sport specific is kind of not a thing. You can, if you want them to get better at shooting, go shoot. There's
Yeah.
nothing that we can do in the gym to mimic that motion
Yeah.
to get that same feeling.
Yeah.
Like again, sprinting. I always talk about sprinting. If you want to get faster, sprint. So having this new age of sport specific and making these exercises look as close to whatever they're doing in the sport, yes, it looks fancy and great, but is there actually any benefits to it?
Yeah. And like I mean, that's kind of, I think that's been an interesting conversation, in the last couple of years, even with some of the athletes that have been on my teams. And even with the coaching staffs that I've worked with as well, is, if you want to be really great at basketball, like what you said, like you need to go put shots up, and I always tell incoming recruits and, when I'm talking to any potential student athletes, at the University of Miami, it's, hey, I'm really, really good at making sure that you're ready for the demands of your sport. But if you're relying on me to improve your 3-point percentage, like I won't be able to do that. That's not in my area of expertise. But if you want to become a more resilient and robust athlete, we got you covered here. We have a methodology, we have principles, we have standards, and that's how we're going to elicit those responses. So
100%. How do you build these perceptions and standards with your athletes as soon as they come in?
yeah, I think it's just, I was really, really fortunate enough for who I learned from. Like when I got into, collegiate strength and conditioning, I learned from, Dave Scholes. I think he's one of the best in the business by far. Joey Burles, Brandon Howard, obviously Alan Bishop and I have worked really closely together. Logan Ogden, all of these guys have been very, very successful in how they structure programming, how they train, their methods that they use. But all of it really comes down to is very intense detail. And I think right off the bat, if you're looking at a session that I'm running, if you're talking to me about training, I keep things very, very basic. I don't overcomplicate things. And I'm very, very specific and detailed in how I want things done, how I want them, and this technique and structure that I want them done. And I'm a huge advocate of using tempo.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I use with my athletes, especially throughout the year, throughout the preseason, throughout our off season, so that rep integrity is really important. It becomes a standard and expectation. Training through full ranges of motion. For me, that's how you build robust and resilient athletes. And I'm much more on the side of technique is always going to precede load. Movement quality is there's something to be said about having good movement patterns, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to move through extreme ranges. And you'd be shocked at when you ask some of these, again, developing younger athletes to get into some of these positions, how unprepared they are. Even if they come in super prepared from a high school program or working with a personal trainer, it is different. So it just provides another training stimulus, a training adaptation, and it really helps in terms of learning. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's something that when I was developing as a coach, that's what I really think coaching is. It's teaching. So there's a lot of teaching that goes on during my
Yep.
sessions, and when athletes are with me. So when they're freshmen, hopefully until when they're seniors, every year they're kind of learning something a little bit new, or learning a slightly different coaching cue, or we're advancing in some of the techniques. So in that regard, that's kind of how I address it a little bit more in
Mm-hmm.
the weight room, and how I kind of start developing some of those standards.
100%. And I think to go back to what you were saying about tempo control and technique, is there, do you look at VBTs and all that stuff for their tempos, or is it just coaching eye that you kind of go off of?
So I use so generally across the board, no matter what, I'm kind of using like the standard, like 4 number tempo. And generally speaking, that's going to be almost on every single exercise. Um, and why I do that, there's two big reasons for me and why I find like so much value in it is because one, I know right off the bat that when I'm teaching and we're teaching rep integrity, when we're teaching progressive overload, that's a way for me to manipulate, some of the exercises, sets, reps without having to change my card with a million new exercises when I'm really trying to keep the main thing the main thing. So obviously, like there's a different way to produce like progressive overload, and that's one way that I manipulate it while still keeping things very, very simple. Um, I think like my athletes do an amazing job. And I feel like, after, even after summer, their freshman year, a lot of them feel a lot more comfortable within the weight room because we do take so much time and put so much emphasis on some of those training parameters.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then
Can
obviously,
you,
like on the flip side, oh, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, can you break down how you increase or like make sure that progressive overload is achieved through that tempo?
Yeah.
Um,
So there's obviously like multiple ways to create adaptation and overload, but I use tempo in terms of time under tension.
mm,
So depending on what I'm trying to elicit during that training block, micro or macro cycle, that's where I'll utilize tempo. So if I'm doing a 4010 tempo, right, that's about 5 seconds of time under tension. So if I'm trying to elicit, a functional hypertrophy, or even a strength bracket, that's going to dictate, whether that's sets and reps, or that's going to be, amount of time under tension per rep. So if I'm trying to do a functional hypertrophy, that's probably going to be anywhere between like 30 to 40 seconds of time under tension per rep or per set.
mm,
So that's going to dictate a little bit of what my set and rep ranges are going to be in. Versus if I'm trying to elicit more of a strength emphasis, then obviously that time under tension and the tempo is going to dictate that rep scheme and set scheme. So it doesn't need to be super fancy. It can be very much, we were doing a 4-2 exo tempo on our front squats for a functional hypertrophy um, block. And now we're moving more into a strength emphasis block. So now we're moving to a 3-0-1-0 tempo. So we're getting about, 25 seconds of time under tension,
Mm.
depending on the rep scheme that I choose. So again, like it sounds really complicated. Actually, what Coach Bishop put like a really great infographic out a couple years ago that broke it down pretty simply in terms of time under tension and the methods that you're using to elicit like a training adaptation. Um, and that's pretty much how I go about it and use it. But there is a time and a place during the season when we incorporate a little bit of like the velocity based training and use some of the speed parameters off of that. Um, but I'd say like 95% of my year, most of my cards will have some type of tempo that we're using
Mhm.
with every exercise.
With tempo training, and I've seen some of your content on social media. You do like a slower descent, which obviously targets a little bit more of the eccentric phase. How does that then impact that injury mitigation aspect that comes with your sport?
Yeah. So, like I'll use extended tempos during certain periods of the year. And that's mostly obviously for like tendon and ligament health and building up some of the resiliency in some of those positions. So, I'll see, if people come through Miami, during the summertime in particular, that's usually generally where I'm doing some of my general prep work. That's where some of our heavier, longer extended eccentrics are usually going to be in. But most of the time, like even if it's not a heavy eccentric block, there will be some type of control. Yeah, that's perfect. That's the shout out, Coach Bishop. Whether it's an extended eccentric block, whether it's a strength emphasis block or even a power emphasis block. For me, I think that there's something to be said about being able to control weight. You
Mhm.
know, working into lengthened or shortened positions. And I've always and continue to be surprised by how much some of my athletes need a little bit more eccentric emphasis when they initially get to me. So I'd say like yes, beginning of off season, you'll see that mostly where I'm using a little bit more of some of the extended eccentrics. Obviously, like trying to get a little bit more time under tension in that regard. But those will change throughout the year depending on the emphasis. We'll end up doing some longer isometric work as we get into like our preseason or in season. Obviously, like trying to stay a little bit further away from some of the overloaded eccentrics or accentuated eccentrics, just to limit any additional soreness. And at that
Mhm.
point, it's probably not the training adaptation that I want for some of my kids.
Basketball is quite a ACL prone sport, specifically with female athletes where they've got smaller ligaments and they're more at risk of happening. So I was kind of wondering if that's something that you've considered through these training programs, that eccentric compared to concentric when they're a little bit more um obviously in their season.
Yeah. I think I don't know if I'd say like, eccentrics are going to solve the, prevalence of ACL
Mhm.
injuries. I think in terms of a principle that I train with, like my training principle of training through a full range of motion, through joint range of motions is more so of how I kind of look at the holistic approach of you know, if they can't fully, squat with their knee or their hamstring covering their calf into full, knee flexion, why is that?
Mhm.
Do they have a structural imbalance through their dorsiflexion of their ankles? Is their hip internal rotation, is that causing an issue? Usually if there's reasons why their joints don't work properly or their movement patterns aren't like working, I guess, in the way that they're naturally designed, there's usually a reason. Um, so one, like I think the principle of training through joint full ranges of motion, I think that to me in itself, I think that starts helping one, at least evaluate where your athletes are at. And then two, if they can get into these extreme positions and we can load them properly with really, really great technique, I think that's down the line where you're setting up your athletes to be more robust and
Mhm.
resilient. Now, when they're in maybe some of those compromising positions in a very unstructured and a very chaotic setting, which is like their sport, at least they've been in a controlled setting under load in those positions that, you know what, I can't say that 100% is going to, prevent ACL tears or anything like that. But if they've accustomed and trained and been in those positions pretty comfortably and we've addressed some of those
Hmm.
imbalances or structural imbalances, I think I'm putting them at a way better position than saying, you know what, just squat to 90 and we'll kind of figure it out from there. So that's kind of the way that I look at it too is, if there's a reason why they can't train into full ranges of motion, there's probably a reason why. And then it's my job to basically look back and say, all right, how are we going to start addressing this so
Hmm.
that one, their joints are working better and that we're training the agonist and antagonist correctly. Like
Yeah,
in those movements and those patterns and, in whatever exercise selection that I'm looking at. So yeah, I think that
yeah,
answers your
100%.
question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. With you having basketball athletes, obviously they're a little bit more taller than most humans. With
Yeah.
limb lengths differences, obviously some exercises have to be adapted and changed
Yeah.
to better suit their sort of specificities. Is that something that you're constantly having to look at your taller athletes and how to adapt their exercising?
Yeah, the longer that I do this, I definitely think that there's some validity. When you're talking about femur length, when you're talking about torso length, and Tom Shepard actually a couple years ago introduced me to a little bit more in terms of thinking of like limb length and how that can create advantage and disadvantaged
Hmm.
exercise selection with the athletes that you're working with. And obviously, having, longer limbed, usually femur, and typically you'll see longer torsoed basketball players as well. That there's going to be certain movement or exercise selection that's going to be much more advantageous to their body type. And obviously, same on the vice versa is a disadvantageous,
Hmm.
exercise selection. So obviously being long femured, I'd say quad development is a little bit more difficult, whereas posterior chain, is something that they probably feel a little bit more comfortable being from a hinge perspective. With that kind of being said, yeah, for sure. I mean, um, whenever we start our squatting progression, that's going to be something off the bat that I'm either anticipating or I'm kind of looking for initially is, are they going to be able to dorsiflex the ankle properly to be able to load the quad? And I think that's probably more specifically why I ask my athletes to do more of an Olympic style front squat
Hmm.
um, or even Olympic style back squat um, because their body type, advantage is not that. So when we're talking about training and building up, resiliency, when we're talking about training and building up adaptation, when we're talking about training and building up capacity, that's probably a weak point in their chain that they, one, don't really like doing, or two, haven't done a lot of. So when we're talking about trying to drive up like um, gosh, what's the word that I'm looking for? I guess, I can't think of the word, but I
Like
guess
training
profile.
limitations?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of an area that right off the bat I kind of know might be a weak point. But that's why, when I'm looking at my programming, if we have to elevate the heels a little bit to provide a little bit more ankle dorsiflexion so we can keep a more vertical chest on our squat so we can load our quadriceps a little bit
Hmm.
more, that's what I'm going to go with. Obviously, like you want to give a piece of the pie to those kids, rowing for some of those longer limbed athletes is going to be more of an advantageous position for them. So they love that stuff, right? I don't know many basketball players that don't love doing arms. Um, on the flip side of that, because their limbs are so long, overhead pressing or any type of pressing movement typically is a little bit more difficult because they have a longer,
Hmm.
basically length to stabilize away from their body. So, in a way that I address that is, and instead of doing a lot of barbell bench pressing, we actually do a lot more dumbbell pressing to
Hmm.
provide a little bit more structural adaptation and stability through that full length of training. So, those are kind of upper body and a lower body like difference in how I kind of address it. But again, like you want to make sure that, you're giving them a little bit of that, piece of the pie so they feel good about it. But then on the flip side, just knowing how some of that limb length, especially working with this basketball population, would change how I would maybe look at a soccer player who
Hmm.
I'd say are typically more quad dominant versus posterior chain dominant just because of their body type.
Yeah, with obviously these training considerations, with obviously different size limbs, I like the example that you gave with the heels elevated because you're able to still keep a little bit more upright in that squat. Having developed the quads in these specific situations, has that transferred over to sort of filling that bucket for them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, for me, when I'm looking at training for lower body, my biggest bang for my buck is going to be my squat. Obviously, like there's going to be, for me, posterior chain, it's going to be either, RDL or deadlift. But really, when I'm looking at developing like lower body strength, that's what I think is, my biggest bang for my buck is my squat. Um, so when you're looking at that, I think if you drive up qualities and building up areas of weakness, that's going to generally drive up their general strength as well.
Hmm.
Um, and on top of that, you'll be surprised by how weak they are in some of these positions that they've never trained. So when you're talking about, low hanging fruit for me, I've seen plenty of people who can quarter squat 500, but they can't do the same on the reverse. And I've seen plenty of, top level NFL dudes who can front squat 315 full depth and can front from a pin 500.
Hmm.
So I think that there is something to be said about full range of motion training can translate to obviously more handled rep or integrity from any type of, partial quarter position, but the same can't be said on the
Yeah.
reverse. So for me, like again, going back to being, strength generalists and building up capacities, to me, like that's the capacity that I want to build up. Because you're always going to get a little bit extra juice whenever you start changing range of motion or joint angle specificity. So that's kind of how I go about that.
I saw a TikToker, and that I need to get off TikTok most of the time because I get so annoyed with people. But there was this Olympic weightlifter that I was watching, and she has like a lot of leg breakages, which is a different issue. But essentially, what made me think about her thing was that she's so strong single legged that although she's like eh, unable to use one limb, she's strong enough on the other limb that she can pick herself up. So
Hmm.
like from like a piston squat, she would be able to like do everything from one leg to get herself up if she say, fell.
Yeah,
So that got me to really think about like single legs and how to use that unilateral to really develop that whole athlete and like
for
really
sure.
balance that out. And when I was across in the States, I learned a lot about like bucket filling and how important that is across programs. What's your thoughts and how do you incorporate bucket filling for your athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all comes down through like the needs analysis, right? Like, I think one way that people say is like, hey, like buckets and making sure that we're hitting all the buckets. And to me, like that's no different than a needs analysis. So as I'm looking through, the way that college athletics here is in the States every year, you're gonna have almost a different team.
Hmm.
You might have, a little bit of carryover from roster to roster, but the last couple of years I've had almost half the team be new every single year. So obviously, every year that needs analysis of each individual player and the team will slightly change. But I think you'll kind of see like I really do think that if you're looking at who you have in front of you, that should really dictate your quote unquote buckets. And for me, right, like structural balance is a principle. So when you're talking about unilateral work versus bilateral work, we do both.
Hmm.
What we're kind of emphasizing will be a little bit different in different periods of the year. So obviously, immediate off season, and then a lot of our off season is going to be a little bit more geared around structural balance, and you'll see probably a little bit more unilateral work. So we're building up some of those capacities. Obviously, as like we start getting into our preseason and in season, you want to make sure that as you're kind of moving into your power or strength or power phases, you want to make sure that you're eliciting that response, and hopefully by then we've balanced things enough out that when we move to a lot more of our bilateral work, we're able to actually produce some of that force that we are hopefully
Mm.
developing and structurally balancing through the last couple of months. So I'm a proponent of both. I don't think that there's a right or a wrong answer on that one. But I do think that there are buckets. It's interesting this summer. What I've done a little bit different with some of I call them like my older kids group, but we have it's my second lifting group, but we got 5 out of the 6 are grad transfers. So they've been training now for almost 5 years. So what I've been doing a little bit differently on their Fridays is based off of some of our sports science testing, based off of some of the conversations that I've had with them individually, is Friday ends up kind of being what I call my catch-all day. So I give them a little bit of freedom in terms of, hey, like what are 2 or 3 exercises or things, areas that you want to work on? And then I'm going to give you 2 or 3 things that one, I'm either seeing, or 2, that we're kind of missing maybe the other 3 days of the week that I want to make
Mm.
sure that we get in by the end of the week. So like that's kind of how I've bucketed some of them. I got a couple of grad students that have had tendonitis issues in the past. And so their Friday ends up being a little bit more tendon loading and knee health work. Um, some of my guards, they like doing a little bit more of their partial work on Fridays. So they're hitting more of like the belt squat on Friday. That's where they feel good about their lift. They feel good about their body. So I want to try to give that to them, but then they're hitting a little bit more of their hip mobility that we might not be able to get on the earlier sessions of the week. So I definitely feel like by position, and then I think by training age, I do try
Mhm.
to bucket them a little bit more. But overall, I still think that there's going to be, exercise selection or principles that, regardless of who I'm working with, that unless they're, unless they're a pro and they've been training for years and years and years at a very, very high level, which I have yet to see at the collegiate level.
Mhm.
Um, I really truly go back to thinking like it's not really about a certain exercise. It's making sure that we're getting really, really great at basic strength generalist, capacities.
Mhm.
Um, like how many of my female athletes can't do a push up when they get here? Almost every single one of them. So like when we talk about, where they need to be, everyone's coming in a little bit different of a different spot, but there's very specific things that I'm looking at and saying like, all right, having a female athlete be able to do a weighted chin up, a full range weighted chin up, to me is way more impressive than being able to bench press 135 pounds. Um,
Agreed.
if we're talking about, again, holistic training and holistic strength generalist approaches to building robust and resilient athletes.
I think with everything that goes on in the world, that word holistic is sort of lost a bit of its umph behind it. But like I do agree that we need to start again. Bodyweight exercising is some of the most important that you can do because like
Oh,
going back to your point, if they can't do a press up but they can bench 115 pounds, like what does that doesn't really mean anything. Like
right.
cool, you benched but you can't lift yourself off the floor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, and then again, it goes back to that. Like, I'm the same with the single leg squats, piston squats, pull ups is a big one for me as well. I'm a big posterior chain guy. So, like, my athletes need to have those fundamentals. Can you leg curl, like on a buzu ball or on a Swiss ball?
Yeah.
Like, those are the exercises that I'll introduce before getting them to do like RDLs and all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And then, I don't know if I've noticed a little bit more, and I'm still young, so I hate even saying this, like the younger coaches. But social media, I think, does obviously have, its impact, right? You see much more is accessible to see what people are doing. And obviously, everyone's only ever going to post the best things that they're doing. But on the flip side of it too is that there's very little context for what you're watching. I mean, I can't think of the last time someone specifically asked me, after I've maybe even posted like a training video, is like, oh, okay, like, so like what is like what you're trying to do? Like, what's your training block? Like, what is your expectation? Like, what are you trying to elicit? People just see some of my girls squatting and they're like, oh, like she just has them squat all the time and like they squat, deep and blah, blah, blah. But that's just might be one little microcycle that I have them in during, our off season training. But I think a lot of the basics have gotten lost. Um,
Hmm.
and I think the patience of the basics, whether that's like society that we live in, it's so fast paced and you have to constantly be changing. But the longer that I do this, the more simple that my training programs become. If my kid can't do a weighted chin up or even a body weight chin up, you know, ultimately to me that's showing signs of body composition, that's showing signs of overall total body strength, that's showing signs to me of, upper back strength, shoulder health, elbow health. So if we're struggling there, there's probably five or six other things that I could probably be working on them doing versus just being like, just let it go, just keep bench pressing your life away, and we'll see how that goes. So
100%. And I think it's like that attention grabbing aspect of social media that because it's not flashy, it's deemed as boring.
yeah,
But program like, and I was speaking to Ray Zingler, who's an amazing S&C coach, and we were discussing that like whatever we post on social media is 1% of what we do,
yep,
right? So they don't get to see the other rest. But again, the fundamentals are the fundamentals. You cannot beat the fundamentals because like that's it works. Like you've built a successful program at the University of Miami because like all your athletes graduate, they make it through the program, they win a lot. So you can't argue with, and again that's also with the head coach being phenomenal. But like having your athletes be able to perform the whole way is a sign of a good S&C coach,
yeah, for
in
sure.
my opinion.
Yeah, I think, obviously here at Miami, we're really, really lucky because we have a really great performance team as well. We have a full time PT that, only works with men's and women's basketball. We obviously have a full time athletic trainer, obviously, myself as a strength and conditioning coach. And then we also have a dietitian that works with women's basketball as well. So, outside of just our awesome coaching staff
Mhm.
that, at the end of the day, right, like all these kids come here to get a really great education and fulfill their goal and aspirations from a basketball standpoint. Everything that happens behind the scene in terms of the support staff, it's all geared towards making sure that we're putting them in the best position for them to develop as basketball players. So I like you said, like the training, it's really, really important to me and how I structure it and how I'm looking at training and how I continue to develop my training, I guess, methodologies. um, but there's a lot that goes into that too. So shout out to the coaching staff that I work with. They obviously do like an amazing job on the basketball standpoint. And then obviously, it's not just me behind the scenes. It's our performance team that makes sure that obviously the recovery aspect, the nutrition
Mhm.
aspect, and the training aspect, like you said, like it's a holistic approach. It's not siloed. It's something that we take like a lot of pride in terms of making sure that all of our student athletes that work or come to the University of Miami for women's basketball get a holistic approach to their training and their development. Um,
100%. Some of the most effective programs that I've seen as well have an outstanding communication between all the departments within the team. And
yeah.
that's like what you're saying, like head coach, physios, nutritionists, just whoever's on that coaching roster. Like the
Mhm.
best example I know is the UFC Performance Institute. Like the S&C coach, the nutritionist, the psychologist, like they will all refer back to each other depending on which athletes need and what. Like
For
I think that that's so important for like program development.
For sure. And I think, with I think the development of sports science and technology and whatnot, like that's just created like another type of feedback loop too, to check on progress, to check on things a little bit more frequently through the season,
Mhm.
without having to, I don't even know how long ago, what used to be like one rep max testing day and things like that. Um, I think that's allowed for training to stay training and to make sure that like there's still checks and balances as we're going, but we're not losing more and more days based off of, hey, we have to do all of these assessment tests like, every couple of months. It's like, hey, no, like we have the force plates now, so we can kind of check some of their power development. We can check some of their rate of braking development, some of their like RFD, like so there's lots of different qualities that we can continue to assess. And regress or progress based off of some of that information too. So, I definitely feel like when you look at some of that high performance model, those are definitely some of the benefits that come with it. And, obviously having seen that done on like the pro sport side and that slowly coming down onto the college side of it too, like it definitely creates a little bit more of like a holistic environment, which is like
Mhm.
what we obviously want to do here.
Yeah, with sort of this, going back to an earlier point that you made, with giving these athletes like the choice on what they want to work on as well, how have you felt that that developed that buy-in with them and that trust with, okay, you actually need to go see your PT just now for whatever reason, or you need to go see your nutritionist or sports scientist or whatever member of the team?
Yeah, so like the autonomy that I give them for the weight room, it's a lot of things that, they're actually like I should say this, like the group that I'm trying this out with on the Friday, I should probably give more of my kids way more credit in terms of like them understanding or at least having an idea of things that they actually do need to
Mm.
work on. So, and like the biggest one that I could give is like the tendonitis protocol. Like the three that I have kind of on that right now, they immediately started by saying like, "Hey, like I want to do stuff for like my knees." So just kind of based off of that, like, that's just them being aware of their bodies a little bit more. And I think that comes from being in systems that allow that to happen. So like when you have professionals and you have like the support staff to be able to provide that information, that just creates more learning for them. So again, like with my older group, with my grad transfer group, basically like they've been around enough and they understand after having played for so many years now how important tendon loading or making sure that their like legs are strong. They understand the importance of nutrition and the inflammation. And so whenever we're talking about some of the supplementation protocols that we have them on, any of the post training or pre training shakes that we have them do, the question is, oh, like, okay, like what's in this and what does this do? And you're like, boom, we got collagen, vitamin D, and mag before the lift. And then we got your multi fish oil and a little bit more magnesium post training. And they're like, cool, got you. So I think it's just a lot more like it creates a little bit more of a learning environment.
Mm.
And then that I think empowers them to like understand like, okay, this is all helping me. This is good for my body. This is going to help me perform at a higher level. This is also going to help me recover at a higher level. So I think with that, like that's what that kind of provides is a little bit more of some, I think, continued education. And then because they feel a little bit more empowered with the knowledge that they have, they feel more empowered. Like when I sit down and talk with them and say, hey, like, what do you want to work on for you? They have a little bit more structure, or a little bit more idea of like what that is.
Hmm. I think, going back to the point that you made earlier, it's all about the teaching that you give your kids. And it's not like you're just a coach, you're also there to teach them a way of managing their body and managing their performance. I think that's dope.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's interesting, and obviously it's like a credit to our like the kids that we bring in and like the coaching staff when they get recruited. But it's interesting to see when they're coming from high school. They're very driven, they're very intense and passionate kids, and I love that. And it's interesting. I think in the last couple of years, I've had to teach more of, hey, like more is not always more. Like let's work smarter, not harder, and just for more.
Hmm.
So I think like also educating athletes on that regard actually has been a little bit more intriguing because they're just used to sometimes just, hey, like if unless I'm like on the floor, like about to pass out, like that wasn't a hard workout. And it's like, no, actually, like what's going to be more beneficial is you being able to come back tomorrow and work at that same intensity that I need you to, and then come back again the next day after you're recovered and do it again. And let's
Hmm.
stack days of training. Let's not go all out on day one and then you can't do anything for 3 days because you just blew everything out. So I think like that conversation actually has been like even more intriguing the last couple of years. Like what you said, like managing your body, not just
Hmm.
obviously building capacities, but recovering capacities and making sure that we're ready day in, day out, not just once a week or twice a week or, hey, now I'm out for a week because I just overdid it.
With your training system, like what, I hate talking about periodization because it's never realistic. But like, what training system do you follow at the University of Miami for the basketball?
I'd say like I follow more of like an undulating like periodization model. Like I think or a concurrent. I don't even know. I mean, I think like at the end of the day, like I don't think there's a point in the basketball season where they're not playing basketball, even in the off season. So I think whether you want to say that you run like a linear or whatever, I think everyone's kind of lying to themselves because I think all throughout the year, no matter what, your kids are jumping, they're sprinting, they're changing direction, they're using their anaerobic, their aerobic system. Like there isn't a really a time, especially more
Mhm.
so in basketball, where they have an off season. So the way that I kind of look at that is just that, during certain blocks of the year, whether that's off season when they have a little bit less basketball time because there's like specific hours of them being on the court versus when we move into our preseason where they're allowed 20 hours in the week and it's basically full blown practices. I think that's kind of how I basically periodize my group out. But I think no matter what, they're always jumping, they're always sprinting, they're always doing max level and max effort things. So
Mhm.
it's my job in the weight room to make sure that I'm understanding where some of the basketball intensities are, and to then from my training program basically either complement that in things that they are getting on top of it or complement in the weight room for things that I know that they're not getting yet. So, like right now, I do not do a lot of conditioning on the court because once we get back in August, that's basically all they'll be is on the basketball court. So we do a lot more like aerobic capacity work in the summer.
Mhm.
I try to keep
Building
them
up
like
the
on the
track.
grass or on the track. I don't do a lot of jump training because they do that in their sport already. We might increase some of the volume of that as we kind of build into preseason because practices are going to start getting a little bit longer. But I don't jump train my kids because they get that from their sport already. So if we're talking about building on capacities, like there's times of the year where I add in a little bit more in terms of like plyometrics and just making sure that we're hitting some of the intensities that they're going to start
Mhm.
seeing a little bit more often. But like I said, like they get a lot of that from their practice, from their skill work, from their sport, from all the extra shots that they're getting. So there's definitely other capacities that I find more valuable to train when I got them in the weight room and I know it can be in a controlled setting.
Yeah. So do you look at their load management in terms of the numbers of reps that they're getting? So say in their on season, they'll probably jump a lot more. So those loads and reps will be higher. But in their off
Yeah.
season, because they're not jumping as much, you'll offset with plyometric training or jump performance
Yeah.
to sort of like keep them at like
And
a steady level.
yeah, so, as we get into season, like as we're kind of building into the preseason, I should say, like that's when I'll start building up some of those volumes a little bit more, whether that's extensive or intensive. And the intensive ones will get a little bit more. We'll get those in a little bit closer to when we get into like full practices, where we're gonna have 3 hours and they're gonna see those intensities a lot more reoccurring. But the time that we're in right now, we're in an 8 hour segment. So they have 4 hours dedicated to me in the weight room and then 4 hours on the court, which is probably the least amount of hours that they'll have with the coaching staff for like 9 months. So they're still getting some of that slow volume,
Hmm.
um, capacity built in some of their skill work. And then as we kind of get back at the start of the semester when our preseason starts, when more of our court running picks up, when more of we're still in kind of that 8 hour block, but we're about 4 weeks away from our official practice time, which then turns into 20 hours. That's when we'll start adding in a little bit more extensive plyometric work and then slowly start building that into some intensive work so that they're seeing some of those capacities built up. And by the time that we kind of get around to that full practice time, we've built up some of those levels, some of those volumes, some of those intensities so that that's going to kind of progress nicely into some of the basketball work. And then obviously as that starts happening into full practices, that's where I'll start peeling some of that off in terms of the volume capacity or the volume amount.
Hmm.
Um, and we'll probably just focus more on some of the intensity of what they're actually hitting,
Yeah.
whether that is through, like a French contrast method, through our force plates if we're having them hit max effort, counter movement jumps. So we're getting some of those intensities in. That's, kind of the way that we look at it, or the way that I look at it and kind of approach it.
The way we got talking is I reached out to you and wanted to know about some of the impact that the menstrual cycle has on female athletes. Now, I did research on that through my undergrad,
Mhm.
and now I'm doing my master's and hopefully PhD on it as well.
Mhm.
But can you just run through some of the experiences that you've had with the impact of the menstrual cycle, and how do you think it impacts as a team and as individuals?
Yeah. So I think the tough part about, obviously, I think all the information and the continued research of how menstrual cycles in particular affect female athletes and how that fluctuates between hormones and, what word am I looking for? Symptoms. And that, what I've kind of found too, like the more that I've learned about it and read about it, is that, every player is going to basically have a different, symptom score, the type of symptoms that they have, and their training capacities. The interesting thing is that we obviously use supplementation here at Miami to kind of, one, aid in some of those symptoms that they might have, whether that be cramping, inflammation, bloating, that they might experience during different parts of the cycle. But I think the caveat and the tough thing, when we're talking about the menstrual cycle in a collegiate setting, is that, whether you're in phase one or phase four, whether you're in phase two or phase three, and you still have a game on Thursday, nothing's
Mhm.
changed in that game. So I think the conversation has more turned to, hey, like, how are you feeling? Hey, I actually feel really fatigued. Hey, so here are some recovery modalities. Here are some nutrition modalities that we're recommending to help alleviate some of these symptoms. Um, and then it's also a casual conversation that we have of, hey, like, when was your last menstrual cycle? Hey, so you're probably in your phase three. So, your recovery and your nutrition for inflammation will probably be one of your most important things that you can do to help with and alleviate some of these symptoms. Or you just started your phase one. So there's going to be, XYZ that you might be feeling. You might not be sleeping, your body temperature is rising. So making sure that, hey, look at your aura ring, make sure that you're kind of seeing some of these trends. Maybe this week in particular, you need to start going to bed 30 to 45 minutes earlier. So I think the more I've used it from, I would say, like a casual standpoint, is recommending ways to alleviate some of the symptoms. Because whether we like it or not, like, we're going to practice. Like, we are going to travel and we are going to have games. So as much as I'd love to individualize every single person's program and training and recovery and how much they're practicing, based off of their cycle, that's just not something that's feasible, I think, at this level on a consistent basis. So I think, like, the next best thing and low hanging fruit that we do try to do is, again, provide the education of, hey, if you're noticing these like reoccurring symptoms around these same times, hey, here's a nutritional protocol that you can do. Here's a recovery protocol that you can do. Electrolytes and hydration are going to be something during different periods of the time. And obviously, sleep tips and sleep
Mhm.
recovery during different phases of the cycle are going to have positive benefits and alleviate some of the symptoms that they are experiencing, if they are. And then I've had
Yeah,
athletes that don't experience very little symptoms, and it's not even a big deal. So I think there's just like a very widespread from what I've seen. And obviously, it will have an impact if they're on birth control, if they're not on birth control, and vice versa too.
yeah. With in terms of supplementations, what is recommended that you've seen to help, depending on which phase?
So, obviously, during, I believe it's phase one and phase three, um, making sure that your magnesium uptake is something that you're being a little bit more cautious about, or if you need some, those are probably the two that I would usually suggest. If we're dealing with any like inflammation issues, fish oil is something that we also recommend to our athletes. But magnesium is typically one of the most prevalently across the board, is increasing some of that. From a nutrition standpoint, like, obviously, like, anti-inflammatory foods, high in antioxidants, berries, fresh fruit, like that, high in omega-3s. So whether they don't like taking the fish oil supplement, getting your omega-3s in from, obviously, like, fresh caught fish, and incorporating some of that into some of their like post practice training meals is something that we definitely look at as well. Um, So I'd say like obviously the magnesium supplementation and then omega 3s are generally going to be like your safest and lowest hanging fruit options when you're looking at from a nutritional standpoint.
Hmm.
Uh, so that's generally like what we will kind of start out with first. And then obviously limiting, some of your processed foods, some of your like high inflammatory foods, seed oils, things like that. If you get extreme cramping, if you do feel bloated and inflamed, those will be things that we kind of address and talk about during, the different phases too.
Yeah, you also kind of mentioned the Aura Ring. How
Mhm.
beneficial have you found that for recovery and just keeping track of their performance?
Yeah, so we use it here at Miami. We we offer it to the athletes, and it's not information that I'm necessarily looking at personally for them. I always want to make sure that when we explain it, it's a benefit to them outside this building. It's not a benefit for me to babysit. So, in that regard, I think the hardest part is getting athletes to maybe see where they can improve, or if they're not feeling a certain type of way, like I didn't feel like I got a good night's sleep, for them to see actual data of like, well, yeah, I didn't go to sleep until 2 a.m. and then I had to get up at 7:30. So I only got, 5.5 hours of sleep. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's why I feel like crap. Or like that's why I didn't sleep very well. So I think it's more so like what I've seen, like the positive benefits of, it's not that, that all of these wearables are 1,000% accurate.
Mm.
But I think it creates awareness for the athletes about some of their habits that they might not necessarily put two and two together. Um, so that's where I found like most of the benefit from is like if we travel too, like I've even seen it on my ring, is that I don't sleep as well in a hotel room. So when I'm planning ahead, like I do go to bed a lot earlier on the road than what I normally would at home. I found like that's always helped me. Some of my athletes have said like when they travel with their own pillows or blankets away, they've noticed on their rings for whatever reason that they sleep a little bit better. Some of their scores are a little bit better versus when they don't travel with some of their like homey things. So it just creates, I think, a little bit more of a conversation too. Obviously, sleep and nutrition are very personal things and they're personal habits. So finding and talking about, what works for each kid or what works for each athlete to better help them. I think that's more of like why I've really liked the Aura rings and allowing
Mm.
our kids to, participate in it, is that it helps continue a conversation of, hey, yeah, like if you look at your ring and you're only getting like 5 hours of sleep every night, like, yeah, no wonder your joints are still kind of achy. Yeah, like your energy levels aren't as good. Your appetite isn't where it needs to be, or you're not consuming as many caloric. You're getting to your caloric intake or your hydration needs because of XYZ. That all kind of starts with like your sleep and your sleep habits. So that's how we
Mhm.
use it at Miami. I'd say it's more of like a forum to casually communicate and to, again, educate for things that like ultimately like I don't decide when they go to bed at night. Like I can decide like
Yeah.
the program, like I can help the coaches plan out practices for load management intensity, but sleep, like that's up to them. So if it's something that it's such a powerful aspect of training, and it's something that like we gave them to help control outside the building, so that like I
Yeah.
said, like I'm not a babysitter. So
100%. And I think that's a good boundary to have with your athletes as well.
yeah, yeah. And some athletes, look at it and they're like, yeah, like it's cool, but I don't really know if I'm going to change anything. And again, like I think that's where again some of this autonomy, some of this, hey, you know what, if we can educate you a little bit more, like maybe you'll find some of this a little bit more interesting, or maybe like you'll just change one thing and that one thing will make you feel a little bit better. So I think it's all just that 1% trying to get a little bit better, trying to get kids a little bit more bought into what we're doing, and ultimately like everything that we're doing for them and giving for them is for them and their
Mhm.
performance. So I think it all
100%.
comes from like a really good spot too.
What is one hill that you would die on in this industry?
Whoa, one hill that I would die on. Um, Gosh, I'm trying to think. Uh,
It's hard. It is hard.
Um, oh gosh, I don't even know if there really is one that I would die on.
Fair. For
Um,
me, I love the human side of S&C, like helping your athletes realize that it's like your performance isn't just who you are. It's
yeah,
also like you've got a life afterwards. So helping them build that.
become people, not just
Yeah,
athletes. Yeah,
100%. So like I will always care for my athletes as more than just athletes.
yeah.
Like, and I know you shouldn't always get too attached to your athletes, but like for me, it's more than just athletes as well.
Oh, for sure. Um, I'd probably take more of like a training approach. And something that like I would like die on a hill of is that I just for me and people make fun of me sometimes, but like technique always has to precede the load. Um, the more that I've like been around this, the more that I realize, you know, it's not my ego that needs to
Mm,
be like stroked. I need to make sure that I'm doing what's right for my athletes. And, that is something that I'll die on a hill of. If
mhm,
something doesn't look right, if they are not moving well, then like that's really hard for me um, to change. Like that's really hard for me to ignore that and just keep loading them and knowing that it's not right. So
mhm,
that's probably something for me. I think maybe like a non-training thing is like you should be constantly learning. I think a lot of people when they get into like a role that they think that they've made it, they stop, going to
mhm.
continuing education things. And I think you're doing your athletes such a disservice if you
I
aren't
think that's quite
constantly.
prevalent in this industry
Yeah,
where people get to certain positions and they'll just stop because they
yeah,
know everything.
yeah. And I just feel like every time I go learn from somebody that I want to learn from because of, how they program, how they train, how their athletes train, um, I feel like I walk away and I'm like, I don't know anything. So, um, for me, like that's something that I've been instilled in with from, one of my mentors, Dave Scholes. Like that was one of his biggest things is he was like, your continuing education is like your investment in yourself. And if you aren't doing that, you aren't investing in yourself. And ultimately, like you aren't investing in your athletes. So why would anyone pay you more money? Why would
Mm,
anyone invest more money into you if you aren't ever trying to make sure that you're investing in yourself to make yourself better? So
I
that's something
agree.
that I would for sure like die on from like a personal standpoint of
Mhm,
I can't stand when people are like, yeah, I just don't really like I haven't really changed anything that I've done. I haven't really looked in or assessed anything that I'm doing. Like, and for me, I think that's just something that like I'm always looking to do something or improve something, or if I have a new group, what can I do to maximize their potential? And it probably won't look the same as what exactly we did last year.
on the back of that, what is your PR song?
Probably like some Blink 182 song.
Ooh, I
That
like.
used to be like a staple. I'd say like for me personally, some type of Blink 182 or some 41. That might age me a little bit. But I mean, my athletes are for sure like some type of Lil Baby, Rod Wave,
Mm,
some rap song that I probably
that's
will get
you.
the name of. Yeah, it's probably well over me at this point. But for me, for sure, it's going to be Blink 182 or some 41.
Nice. That is that's so I call that my college playlist. And like when I was like in
Yeah.
education, that's what I was listening to like heavily.
Oh, for sure, same. That's why it's funny because most of my kids don't even know who Blink 182 is, which is so sad. Um, occasionally we'll do country, but for the most part, it's gonna be rap. So,
Mm. To be fair,
but
like
mine's
my PR songs are usually rap based, but like
oh,
if
are
I
they?
want to feel nostalgia, yeah, nostalgia is
Yeah,
more like Blink 182, Paramore, Fall
yeah,
Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, like
yes,
that.
yeah. That's that's generally what I'll throw on. Like after I'm done with lift groups, I cannot listen to rap music anymore. So it's either country or Blink 182 or like Afro beats or something that is
Mm,
not rap music. So it'll be
nice.
something like that, unless it's old school rap. we're talking like Lupe or the old Kanye or old Jay-Z type deal. So
I like it. This one doesn't
yeah.
get discussed as often, but what's your go-to conditioning playlist?
Oof. Um, I think honestly, it's usually like some type of Rihanna.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
that usually gets like the kids going a little bit, or like Beyonce, my strong female artists usually get the girls going a little bit. But for me personally, it's probably still going to be like Blink 182, like something that I can't hear myself like suffering from. So I'd say like
I think that's
generally
a
that's
goal with
where I
conditioning.
go. So that's generally like what I'll do. But for my athletes, I try to do something a little bit more upbeat, unless they're picking
Mm,
it and then they kind of choose whatever. So
yeah. And then what is some advice that you would give new strength and conditioning coaches or coaches wanting to come into the industry?
yeah, that's always a good one. I think there's probably like two things. There's two things that I always I feel like harp on or make sure that I reiterate. If any young strength coach calls me, is one, like you need to go find a mentor, um, and the logo does not matter.
Hmm.
So go learn from somebody that you, even if it's on social media. I really love the way that Coach Bree squats her kids. Well, great. Go learn from that person and like dedicate your time. And make sure that like you're paying for an option for that. But go learn from them. Like don't just go to 10 different people just because you want to meet 10 different people. Um, again, like I was really lucky in my GA. I worked with some of who I consider the best in the business, and I learned so much from them. And like that's the reason why I am where I am today. And then on top of that, too, like there are people that I can call because I
Mm,
invested so much time learning from them. And I just feel like that's where I've seen a lot of young strength coaches struggle is they just don't have somebody that they can, one, go learn from, and two, continue to learn from as they're developing as like young strength coaches. Because it definitely doesn't stop after your GA or an intern. And then we kind of already talked about this, but again, like Dave Scholes, like he's the dude. I owe him literally everything. He's literally one of the smartest people that I know. But the continuing education, every year I'm evaluating like, what we did, how we did it, how well we did it. Did we do what I needed us to do? And then from there, I'm trying to go learn something to help bring back and make my team better. Whether that's learning from, Christian Thibodeau, from Ben Prentice, from Coach Bishop. There's a lot of different people, Spina, FRC, that was something that, really was helpful to me in my programming and what I do. But then, I really like nutrition. So I started learning a lot more about that. And, again, from a holistic standpoint,
mhm,
nutrition and training, they go together. So I think just making sure that you're constantly learning and again, investing in yourself to make sure that you're bringing as much value as humanly possible. I think that's something that everyone wants to talk about salaries and, wanting to make more money and things like that. But, at the end of the day, like how much value do you bring to your organization? How
mhm,
much value do you bring to your staff? How much value do you bring to your student athletes? And for me, like if you aren't trying to get better, then yeah, maybe your salary won't go better. Maybe it won't go up. Maybe people won't value as much. So
100%.
for a young strength coach to hear that, like go be valuable, go be, an asset to whoever you're working for and whoever you're providing service to.
Hmm.
So I'd say those
The
are probably like my two biggest ones.
100%. Like the way I look at it, it's all investments,
Yeah.
right? So it might suck to pay out of pocket to say buy a nutritional course, but also makes you a better programmer because
Oh,
then
for
you have a little bit more knowledge on okay, this is actually targeting this area. This is some ways to offset those like residuals that might happen from it. Like
Mhm.
for me, I'm in the UK, so going to America was very costly. But I didn't
Mhm.
see it as an expense thing. I saw it as an investment. Like now I have contacts with some of the greatest strength coaches in the world because I sucked it out for the year and I just saved and then went across there.
Oh, for sure. And I think the other I maybe I have a third one. And the third one too is, again, like the social media content and the like era that we're in, get under the bar and train.
Mm-hmm,
I think with, again, huge benefits of sports science, I think we have a lot of people who know how to work an iPad and very little people who actually know how to squat. So in
retweet.
that regard, get under the bar, train, go through your training programs, see what it feels like. You know, I think not only that, but it develops your coaching eye. If you know how certain things feel, you will also know how well or how it should look.
Mm-hmm,
And I don't think I developed like any more quick than I did at Utah State because I was also training. I was Olympic style lifting. I'd never done it before. And I feel so comfortable looking, watching, and correcting because I was doing it too. I've done it. I
mm-hmm,
can do it. I can preach what I'm coaching and I can coach what I'm teaching. So I think, like,
100%.
in that regard too, like, get under the bar and train, like, feel it, strain, because that's just going to give you even more, I think, credibility with your athletes and whoever you're working with. Because it's
100%.
like, no, I know exactly what I'm looking for. I know what this feels like. I know this kind of sucks, but here's how we're going to adjust it. Or, hey, yep, like that was perfect. Or, hey, you know what? That didn't look that great. This is where you should be feeling it, XYZ. So I think that just, again, like small investment, that's an investment in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Is
I, to piggyback off that, it's first of all the 1,000 rep rule. If you do one thing 1,000 times, you're going to get really fucking good at it.
for
So
sure.
you know what it should looks like. The
Hmm.
second is you start knowing when it sucks. Like
Hmm.
for me, the conditioning is the prime example of it. If you're giving your athletes like Tabata style workouts or 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and you've done it yourself, you know, okay, cool. By the second rep, they
Yeah.
hate me. So let
Yep.
me make sure that I'm talking to them and like encouraging them, pushing them. Let's go, let's go, let's go, push, push, push. You've got more in there. Like
Yep.
just giving them that encouragement to know that okay, they actually know what I'm going through as well.
Yep. I 1,000% agree. So yeah, those would kind of be like my three, I guess, is obviously train, get into the bar, and go find a mentor who's going to help you, and not just be, somebody that you chatted to for 10 minutes.
Hmm.
So go find somebody that you want to learn from. And I
100%
think
agree.
that will usually set you up for, a good network and put you in a good place where people are, mentoring you and making sure that you're getting better too.
Hmm. Like this is a reason why I love this podcast. Is like I'm very selective of who comes on because I like to know that they've taken the time and effort to educate themselves to a point that they like every coach's opinion is different, every view is different, but at least they can justify it, and that's like that's what I like, and I like to have these different arguments between different things.
For sure.
But this podcast, and I've said this a million times, but it's very selfishly for me because I love learning.
For sure.
So like getting the different opinions, I love it. But it's also creating a platform out there for people who might not be able to reach out to say Coach Bree or
Mhm.
Zingler or Thomas Newman, like Coach Mack, like these coaches just straight off the bat, but they can still hear what they base their programs off of.
For sure, for sure. No, and I think that's obviously like, the positive side of, again, podcasts, social media is that you have a little bit more access to see and also learn from. Like, even when I was a GA back in like 2017, I mean, I was still like sending emails to coaches and things like that. Versus now, people will DM me or, comment on something or email me still. So, no, I mean, again, like, I don't think social media or, podcasting or anything is a negative. It for sure is a benefit and a positive, and should make it way easier to be able to connect with, like what you're saying, coaches from not just America but like all over the world too.
Mhm.
There's
Oh,
amazing coaches and sports scientists and researchers, all over the world. So that's
mhm.
been like really great, even for me too, is being able to obviously broaden out my networking and being able to learn a little bit more about specifics, especially when I was on like the soccer side as well.
100%. And that's like, I'm in a fortunate position that I'm in Europe, so I get this side of the coaching as well. It's a little bit
Mhm.
different and not as open as the US, I will admit.
Yeah,
But the ones that are willing to come on and like talk about things are like great coaches, and they're usually like top coaches in that field
and
or that, yeah, which is dope. Like I love connecting coaches to each other as well. So it makes
for
my
sure.
job easier when I've got this like somewhat platform where I can be like, oh yeah, she's really good at this. Go speak to her. Like
Yeah, for
I will
sure.
always talk about Caroline Gagne. She's an S&C coach, but she focuses a lot of on the yoga side of things.
Okay.
So movement performance for her is more of a like a controlled breathing, like more again like what we are saying, like holistic approach to movement. Like really go back to the basics of it. So like I will always talk about her because she's phenomenal. And like I interned with her, so like
So
to
you've
have
seen.
that content, yeah. So I've seen it firsthand as well. Like she was doing the yoga for the American football team at the University of Washington.
Mhm.
That's a big stage. So and she like she had two groups every day and she just killed it every single time. And then she'd go into the weight room and coach them there too. So it was
Yep.
like I got to see how that impacted like the athletes and that relationship that she was able to build with them as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's dope. And it's
No.
just a different way to train. It's a different way to approach like a performance team. So no, I agree. It's awesome.
Yeah, no, appreciate you for coming on today. Um, I
Of
know that you
course.
have an event coming up.
Oh, yep, we do. So, Coach Jimenez, that's at Missouri State. She's doing a online um, coaching clinic. So there's a couple of us speaking, and the donations go to their new weight room renovation, I believe. And there's a couple, really, really well known and great practitioners. Um, and I will also be joining them. But I don't think it's been announced, but I'm going to be doing a little bit more on periodization of and utilization of FRC within a basketball training program and how I use it with my athletes and how I kind of periodize it and look at it throughout the year. We use that methodology and principle from Dr. Spina quite often, and I find it super beneficial to the population that I work with. And I believe it's August 24th. So if I'm not incorrect on
Yes,
that.
it is.
Okay. So no, it's a great lineup. Obviously, like registration's still open. It's all virtual, so it'll be on Zoom. Um, so anyone around the world is more than welcome to attend, and it's going to be a great group of speakers. So it should be good.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you so much for coming on today. If you also give people where they could reach out to you and sort of get
Yeah,
to
sure.
pick your
So
brain.
my Twitter, I think, is Brienne Brown 10. Uh, and then my Instagram, that's usually like one that I'm a little bit more, I guess, like active on. So if anyone like messages me or something, yeah, it should just be my Instagram is Coach Bri Brown. Um, I'll reply on Twitter. I just don't go on as much. My Instagram's probably my most like active social media one. So if anyone wants to reach out, they're more than willing or welcome to do so. And be patient, but I'll get back to you on it.
She does. That's how we got in contact with each other. So I will
Yeah.
vouch for you.
Sometimes a little bit slower, but I try to respond to everybody.
No, perfect. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Manny.